The autumn of 1807 brought an unprecedented arrival to the president's house in Washington. One day in October, without much warning, 2 live grizzly bear cubs were deposited on the doorstep of Thomas Jefferson. They were a living, breathing, and profoundly wild testament to the vast, mysterious American West, a gift from the explorer Captain Zebulon Pike. His letter, explaining that he had acquired the male and female cubs in the southern reaches of the Continental Divide, arrived at almost the exact same moment, creating a sudden and startling reality for the third president. The untamed frontier was no longer an abstract concept mapped on paper, but a tangible and formidable presence at the very center of American power. Most Americans of that era had never laid eyes on a grizzly bear, and now, 2 of them were temporary residents at the nation's executive mansion, embodying the raw potential and inherent danger of the continent Jefferson was so determined to understand. This unusual delivery was, in many ways, the logical culmination of Jefferson's presidential vision. His gaze was fixed firmly westward, driven by a deep intellectual curiosity and a strategic ambition for a continental nation. The Louisiana Purchase had doubled the size of the country, and Jefferson, a man of the Enlightenment, was not content to let this new domain remain a blank space on the map. He had personally commissioned his secretary, Meriwether Lewis, to lead the Corps of Discovery with Captain William Clark on their famed expedition from 1804 to 1806, with explicit instructions to document the geography, climate, plants, and animals of the uncharted territory. In response, the White House itself had transformed. The grand entrance hall, typically a formal receiving area, had become a veritable museum of the West. By 1806, it was filled with objects sent back by the explorers: massive antlers, exotic snakeskins, animal pelts, and intricate costumes from the native tribes they had encountered. For Jefferson, these were not mere curiosities. They were data points in his grand project of comprehending and ultimately integrating the West into the American Republic. The arrival of live specimens was simply the next, albeit more challenging, step in this national pursuit of knowledge. Among all the discoveries cataloged by Lewis and Clark, 178 new plants and 122 new animals, none captured the American imagination with as much awe and terror as the grizzly bear. This was not the familiar black bear of the eastern forests. Pike's letter to Jefferson echoed the reports from the Corps of Discovery, noting that the native peoples of the West considered the grizzly the most ferocious animals of the continent. The journals of the expedition were filled with harrowing tales that solidified this reputation. The explorers wrote of bears that could absorb 5 or 6 rifle balls and still charge with astonishing speed and fury. On May 5, 1805, Captain Clark recorded killing a brown or grizzly bear that he estimated weighed 500 pounds. Lewis thought it was closer to 600. The creature was so formidable that it became a benchmark for the raw power of the New World, a living refutation of European theories that nature in the Americas was somehow diminished. The scientific community, working from the expedition's findings, would later give the animal a name that perfectly captured its essence: Ursus horribilis, the horrible bear. This was the animal that now sat outside Jefferson's office. Having just received Lewis and Clark in Washington upon their return, Jefferson was intimately familiar with their first-hand accounts of the grizzly's might. He knew instantly that these cubs, however small, could not remain. In a letter to his granddaughter, Anne Carey Randolph, he stated his decision plainly: "These are too dangerous and troublesome for me to keep." His immediate plan was to send them to his friend Charles Willson Peale, an artist and naturalist who operated a popular museum in Philadelphia. However, arranging the transport took time, and in the intervening 2 months, the rapidly growing cubs outgrew their initial cage. To house them, a special enclosure was built on the lawn of the president's house, turning the animals into a public spectacle for any curious passerby. This decision, born of practical necessity, provided an irresistible opportunity for Jefferson's political opponents. They gleefully began to refer to the presidential grounds as his bear garden, a term that evoked the rowdy, unrefined arenas of Elizabethan bear-baiting. The nickname was a pointed political jab, suggesting that the president's scientific pursuits had led to a chaotic lack of decorum at the executive mansion, transforming the seat of government into a wild sideshow. It was an early and potent example of how a president's personal interests could be twisted and weaponized for political attack. The final chapter of the bear's story unfolded in Philadelphia. Jefferson, in his letter to Peel, had stressed that the cubs were perfectly gentle and appear quite good-humored, having been raised by humans. Peel, ever the devotee of natural science, cheerfully accepted the charge, expressing his hope that they would breed and grow to their full size, allowing the public to witness the majesty of these western beasts. For a time, the plan seemed to work, but as the bears matured, their innate wildness began to surface, replacing their cub-like demeanor with a growing ferocity. The precise timeline is unclear, but the experiment in domestication ended in terror. One of the grizzlies broke free from its large cage, rampaged through the museum, and cornered the Peel family before it was shot and killed in the basement kitchen. The other bear was put down shortly thereafter. Both were then mounted and placed on display, fulfilling Peel's goal of educating the public, but in a far more somber manner than he had intended. They became a permanent, silent lesson. The vast wilderness of the American West, which they represented, could be explored, catalogued, and even put on display, but it could not be truly tamed. From the wild frontier to the manicured lawn of the president's house, and finally to the confines of a museum display, the journey of Jefferson's grizzlies was a powerful metaphor for a young nation grappling with the immense and untamable continent it was destined to inherit. The scientific and orderly world of the East had met the raw power of the West, and the encounter left a lasting, cautionary tale. As the rustic scientific era of Thomas Jefferson gave way to the presidency of James Madison, the atmosphere within the White House underwent a profound transformation. The halls, once a museum of Western artifacts and home to grizzly cubs, now became the epicenter of a sophisticated and politically charged social scene, masterfully orchestrated by First Lady Dolly Madison. Celebrated for her exceptional social graces, Dolly understood that the drawing rooms of the Capitol could be as crucial as its legislative chambers in forging a national identity and smoothing the sharp edges of partisan politics. At the center of this vibrant world, often perched on the First Lady's shoulder, was a creature as colorful and spirited as the society she cultivated, a green macaw named Polly. This parrot was far more than a simple pet. She was a participant, a conversation piece, and a living symbol of the elegance and intrigue of the Madison administration. Polly's personality was a study in contrasts, perfectly mirroring the capital city she inhabited. Acquired as a gift from a South American diplomat, her exotic presence was an immediate symbol of the Madisons' status and international connections. Dolly Madison, a shrewd social strategist, recognized the parrot's value. She would often enter crowded reception rooms with Polly on her shoulder, using the brilliant bird to engage with timid guests who might otherwise have been too intimidated to approach the First Lady. Polly's cosmopolitan allure was enhanced by her ability to speak French, a skill she learned from the White House's French-born chief steward, John Quincy, with whom she shared a special bond. However, beneath this charming exterior was a notoriously aggressive and unpredictable nature. To many, Polly was known as the terror of visitors. She was prone to dive-bombing guests, and one account recalls her chasing the daughter of the Secretary of the Navy to nip at her feet. Even President Madison was not immune. On one occasion, while attempting to rescue a guest from the parrot's formidable beak, he had his own finger bitten to the bone, an injury he reportedly endured with good humor. Within the household, the cry, "Polly is coming," was not a playful announcement but a genuine warning, especially to the children. In this way, Polly embodied the dual nature of Washington society itself, a world of outward elegance and charm that concealed sharp-edged conflicts and the potential for sudden attack. This lively but tense social world was shattered in August 1814, when the War of 1812 reached the capital's doorstep. As British forces marched on Washington, threatening to burn the city's public buildings, the president's house was thrown into a state of emergency. In this moment of national crisis, Dolly Madison displayed remarkable courage and foresight. With the president away and the enemy fast approaching, she directed the frantic evacuation of the mansion. Her most famous act was her insistence on saving the iconic Lansdowne portrait of George Washington, a powerful symbol of the young republic's legitimacy. She refused to abandon the building until the large canvas was removed from its frame and secured. Yet, in that same desperate hour, she made another, more personal decision that speaks volumes about her character. She ensured the rescue of her beloved parrot. The steward, John Quincy, was tasked with carrying Polly to safety, possibly finding her refuge at the French consulate for a time. By saving both the nation's founding father on canvas and her vibrant, living companion, Dolly Madison made a profound statement. She understood that the preservation of a nation depended not only on its foundational public symbols, but also on the personal, human elements that give those symbols life and meaning. The parrot was more than a pet. She was a witness to the history made within those walls, and her survival was an integral part of the story of national resilience. After the war and the completion of James Madison's presidency, Polly accompanied the family into retirement at their Virginia estate, Montpelier. She was, according to the Madisons' niece Mary Cutts, the one pet brought with from Washington, a living link to their tumultuous and triumphant years in the capital. At Montpelier, Polly's spirited nature remained undiminished. Unlike other birds Dolly kept in an aviary, Polly continued to be a free-ranging and formidable presence, allowed to roam the estate at will. Her life, which had begun in a distant land and seen the heights of American society and the flames of war, came to a tragic and sudden end. One evening, through the carelessness of a household servant, she was not brought back to her perch inside the hall. A nighthawk, descending from the dark Virginia sky, pounced upon the aging parrot, ending the life of a creature that had been a constant in Dolly's life for at least 30 years. Polly the parrot had been a diplomatic tool, a domestic terror, a symbol of elegance, and a survivor of a national catastrophe. Her story, intertwined with that of one of America's most influential first ladies, offers a unique, feathered perspective on a formative era of American history, reminding us that even in the grand narrative of presidents and politics, the most telling details can sometimes be found in the lives of their smallest companions. The transition from the refined world of the Madisons to the populist, frontier-forged era of Andrew Jackson marked one of the most significant shifts in American political culture. The White House, once a stage for delicate social maneuvering, became the command center for a president known for his iron will, fiery temper, and rugged demeanor. It is fitting, then, that the most famous animal associated with Old Hickory was not a symbol of elegance or scientific curiosity, but a creature whose legendary personality was as robust and controversial as his own. This was Pole, an African gray parrot who became Jackson's cherished companion and, according to a story that has echoed through the generations, the most scandalous mourner in presidential history. The tale of Pole is a fascinating blend of private sentiment and public folklore, offering a window into the character of one of America's most formidable leaders. The bond between Jackson and his parrot was forged in grief. In 1827, Jackson purchased Pole for his beloved wife, Rachel, for the sum of $25. Tragically, Rachel passed away just a year later, shortly after Jackson's contentious election to the presidency. In the wake of this devastating loss, the parrot became a living link to his late wife, and Jackson took over the bird's care himself. His affection for Pole is evident in his personal correspondence. While serving in Washington, he would write to his nephew, William Donaldson, who was looking after the bird at his Tennessee home, the Hermitage, inquiring after Pole's health. In one letter, Donaldson assured the president that the parrot was doing well, describing her as fat and saucy as ever. This private concern reveals a softer, more domestic side of a man known to the public for his unyielding political battles and gruff exterior. For Jackson, Pole was not just a pet but a treasured responsibility and a source of comfort, a constant presence that connected him to the life he had shared with Rachel. This quiet, personal history stands in stark contrast to the public legend that has defined the parrot's place in American lore. The centerpiece of Pole's story is the alleged incident at Andrew Jackson's funeral, held at the Hermitage on June 10, 1845. The scene, as recounted, is one of high drama and profound irreverence. As thousands of mourners gathered to pay their respects to the former president, the solemnity of the occasion was reportedly shattered by a loud and disruptive voice. According to the tale, Pole the parrot, agitated by the crowd, got excited and commenced swearing so loud and long as to disturb the people and had to be carried from the house. The attending clergyman, Reverend William Menifee Normant, is the sole source for this remarkable event. He described the bird letting loose perfect gusts of cuss words, which left the assembled crowd horrified and awed at the bird's lack of reverence. The image is indelible. At the very moment the nation was mourning its great and controversial hero, his closest companion offered a eulogy so profane it had to be forcibly removed from the proceedings. However, after presenting this dramatic story, a closer historical examination reveals that its foundations are remarkably thin. The entire legend rests on the single, uncorroborated account of Reverend Normant. Critically, Normant was only 15 years old at the time of the funeral, and he did not write down his recollection of the event until 1921, a full 76 years after it supposedly occurred. Historians such as Dan Feller of the University of Tennessee have characterized the story as uncontroverted but also unauthenticated, meaning that while no one has disproven it, there is no supporting evidence to confirm it. A search of Jackson's extensive papers, including his last will and testament, reveals no mention of the parrot, leaving its ultimate fate unknown. The tale of the swearing parrot exists in a gray area between history and folklore, a story passed down not because of its verifiable accuracy, but because of its powerful resonance. Ultimately, the historical truth of the incident is perhaps less important than its cultural significance. The legend of Pole has endured for nearly 2 centuries because it so perfectly encapsulates the public persona of Andrew Jackson. Old Hickory was famous for his gruffness, his violent temper, and his salty vocabulary. The idea that his own parrot, his closest confidant in his final years, had learned to swear directly from him, is a story that simply feels true to his character. The parrot's disruptive outburst at a formal state event perfectly mirrors Jackson's own disruptive impact on the American political establishment. He was the outsider who crashed the party of the Eastern elite, and his parrot, in its own small way, did the same at his funeral. The story functions as a form of historical memory, preserving the essence of Jackson's character far more effectively than a dry recitation of his political achievements. It bridges the gap between his public and private life, suggesting that the tough, profane exterior seen by the world was the same personality known to his closest companion. In Pole, we see the reflection of a president whose character was too large and unruly to be contained, even by the solemnity of his own final rites. The annals of presidential pets are filled with peculiar tales, but few are as thrilling as the story of Martin Van Buren and his White House tigers. As the popular legend goes, early in his presidency, the 8th president received a magnificent and exotic gift from Said bin Sultan, the Sultan of Muscat and Oman, a pair of young tiger cubs. Van Buren, a man of refined tastes, was reportedly delighted with the animals and made immediate plans to house them at the executive mansion, adding a touch of the wild to the nation's capital. His excitement, however, was short-lived. An incensed Congress, upon learning of the president's new pets, intervened forcefully, arguing that the tigers were a gift to the United States, not to Van Buren personally. They ordered the animals to be confiscated. After a heated dispute, a reluctant Van Buren was forced to relinquish his striped companions, who were promptly sent to a local zoo. This dramatic tale of a president's battle with Congress over his exotic pets has been repeated for generations, appearing in publications from the National Park Service and even finding its way onto Snapple bottle caps as a certified real fact. It is a perfect historical anecdote, memorable, amusing, and seemingly illustrative of the unique challenges of the presidency. There is only one problem with the story. The whole thing is probably made up, at least the bit about the tigers. A deep dive into the historical record reveals a far more complex and legally nuanced story, one that involves not tigers, but a diplomatic tangle over horses and lions. The popular myth appears to be a conflation of two separate and very real incidents that occurred during Van Buren's administration. The first event did in fact involve a gift from the Sultan of Oman in 1839. However, the manifest of the ship Sultana listed not tigers, but 2 fine Arabian horses, along with 150 pearls, shawls, and a gold-mounted sword. The second incident originated in Tangier, Morocco, where the local U.S. consul was presented with a gift from the Sultan of Morocco: 2 adult lions, 1 male, and 1 female. The historical record shows that these 2 distinct events, involving 2 different rulers and 2 different pairs of large felines and equines, eventually merged in the public imagination, their details blurring over time until the more exotic and exciting tiger narrative emerged and took hold. The true story, while lacking the dramatic flair of a presidential fight for pet tigers, is historically far more significant, as it provides a valuable early case study of the U.S. government grappling with the Constitution's Emoluments Clause. This clause, designed to prevent corruption and foreign influence, restricts federal officials, including the president, from accepting gifts from foreign states without the approval of Congress. Far from being a president who defiantly tried to keep exotic animals for himself, the historical Van Buren was a leader acutely aware of his constitutional obligations. Upon learning of the impending gifts from Oman, Van Buren proactively wrote to the Sultan to politely decline them, citing his duty to his country. Unfortunately, the ship arrived in New York before his letter could, forcing the State Department to accept the items on behalf of the U.S. government. Similarly, when confronted with the lions from Morocco, Van Buren did not attempt to claim them as personal property. Instead, he took the matter directly to Congress, asking for a formal process to handle such diplomatic gifts in a way that was consistent with the law. The actual fate of these diplomatic animals was decided not by presidential whim, but by congressional resolution and public auction. After some debate, which included an objection from former President John Quincy Adams about the potential dangers of allowing a president to dispose of such gifts, Congress passed a resolution allowing the government to officially accept the presents and then sell them. The proceeds were to be directed to the U.S. Treasury. Consequently, the lions were not sent to a zoo, as the National Zoo would not be founded for another 5 decades. Instead, they were sold at a public auction at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, fetching a sum of $370 for the national coffers. One of the Arabian horses was reportedly purchased by a former Secretary of War. This methodical, legal process reveals a young government actively working to interpret and enforce a key anti-corruption principle of its founding document. The real story is not one of a president's personal pets, but of a nation establishing protocols to safeguard its integrity. The myth persists because, as one analysis notes, it is an easier story to tell and a more digestible illustration of a complex constitutional issue. The tale of Van Buren's tigers is a powerful example of how history is often simplified, with complex truths about constitutional procedure being replaced by a more memorable, if entirely fabricated, narrative about a man and his tigers. The year 1868 found the American presidency in its most perilous state since the nation's founding. Andrew Johnson, who had ascended to the office after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, was a man under siege. The country was deeply fractured in the aftermath of the Civil War. and Johnson's lenient approach to the Reconstruction of the South put him on a collision course with the radical Republican-controlled Congress. His repeated vetoes of legislation aimed at protecting the civil rights of newly freed African Americans had created a bitter and irreconcilable political feud. This conflict reached its zenith in February 1868, when the House of Representatives voted to impeach the president on 11 articles, primarily charging him with violating the Tenure of Office Act by attempting to dismiss his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. As the trial began in the Senate, Johnson faced the real possibility of being the first president removed from office, a political storm of unprecedented magnitude raging around him. Amidst this public turmoil and profound personal stress, a quiet and secret drama was unfolding within the private quarters of the White House. Andrew Johnson is one of the very few presidents in American history to have had no official pets during his time in office. Yet, during the darkest days of the impeachment process, he found companionship in the most unlikely of creatures. He discovered a family of white mice living in his bedroom. In a gesture that stands in stark contrast to his public image as a stubborn and combative politician, Johnson did not call for an exterminator. Instead, he befriended them. This small, private act of kindness offers a rare and humanizing glimpse into the life of a man facing immense political and personal isolation. While the nation debated his fitness for office, Johnson created a miniature peaceful world for himself, shielded from the acrimony that defined his public existence. This secret friendship developed into a daily ritual of solace. As the impeachment proceedings dragged on in the Senate, becoming a public spectacle that captivated the nation, Johnson would retreat to his room and tend to his small companions. He would leave out flour and grain from his own mills in Tennessee, along with a small dish of water for the mice to eat and drink. He watched their antics, finding a measure of comfort and distraction in their simple existence. He referred to them affectionately as his little fellows, and, over time, claimed to have earned their trust. This quiet, consistent act of nurturing provided a stark counterpoint to the destructive political battle being waged against him just down the hall. In the silence of his room, surrounded by his rodent friends, the embattled president found a brief respite from a world that seemed determined to tear him down. This secret alliance, however, was not without its own internal conflict, creating a fascinating subplot within the White House itself. While the president was quietly feeding the mice, his daughter, Martha Johnson Patterson, who served as the official White House hostess due to her mother's poor health, was waging her own determined war on the residence's rodent population. Unaware of her father's secret, Martha was on a mission to eradicate every mouse and rat from the historic home. She brought in a formidable arsenal for the task: poisons, traps, and cats. This created a situation rich with irony, a house divided against itself on the smallest of scales. While Martha executed a campaign of extermination on one floor, the President of the United States was secretly conducting a campaign of protection and sustenance on another. This small domestic conflict serves as a powerful metaphor for the larger, irreconcilable divisions that plagued the nation during Reconstruction. The White House, the ultimate symbol of national unity, contained within its own walls two opposing strategies, one of nurturing and one of eradication, mirroring the national debate over how to deal with the defeated South. In the end, Andrew Johnson survived his political trial by the narrowest of margins. On May 16, 1868, the Senate voted on the key articles of impeachment. 35 senators voted guilty, but this was one vote short of the two-thirds majority required for conviction. Johnson was acquitted and served the remainder of his term. The historical record, however, is silent on the fate of his little fellows. It is unknown whether they managed their own narrow escape from Martha's campaign or ultimately fell victim to it. Their story remains a poignant footnote to a tumultuous presidency, a testament to the fact that even in moments of great historical crisis, the human need for simple companionship endures, and that the most revealing aspects of a leader's character can sometimes be found not in their public proclamations, but in their quietest, most private acts. The story begins with a moment of national celebration. Between 1824 and 1825, the United States was captivated by the grand return of a revolutionary hero, the Marquis de Lafayette. The last surviving Major General of the Continental Army, Lafayette had been invited by President James Monroe to tour the nation he had helped to create. His journey across all 24 states was a triumphant procession, met with enormous parades, heartfelt speeches, and adoring crowds at every stop. In September of 1825, near the end of his tour, Lafayette was a celebrated guest at the White House. There, he met with the newly inaugurated 6th President, John Quincy Adams, a man who, like Lafayette, was a living link to the nation's founding generation. It was out of this historic meeting that one of the most bizarre and enduring legends in presidential history was born: the tale of the White House alligator. The legend, repeated in countless books, articles, and historical trivia lists, is as thrilling as it is strange. The story claims that the Marquis de Lafayette, having received an alligator as a gift during his travels through the American South, decided to re-gift the creature to his host, President Adams. Adams, a man known more for his stern intellect than for his whimsy, supposedly accepted the reptile and gave it a home in a most unusual place: a bathtub in the bathroom of the still unfinished East Room. The most compelling detail of the story, the part that has ensured its longevity, is the claim that Adams took a mischievous pleasure in his reptilian resident. He allegedly enjoyed leading unsuspecting guests to the bathroom, only to reveal the formidable creature lurking in the tub, startling them with a flash of teeth and scales from the American wilderness. The image is captivating: a stoic New England president using a live alligator as a presidential party trick. Yet, for all its excitement, a critical investigation into the story's origins reveals that it rests on a foundation of historical silence. When historians search for primary source evidence to corroborate the tale, they find nothing. The alligator makes no appearance in the meticulously kept diaries and voluminous letters of John Quincy Adams, a man who was an avid and detailed chronicler of his own life. It is likewise absent from all known accounts of Lafayette's American tour, including the journals kept by his secretary, Auguste Levasseur. While records from the tour do mention that Lafayette saw monstrous alligators during his travels in the South, there is no mention of him ever acquiring one. The editorial assistants at the Adams papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society have confirmed that they receive the question often, but can find no contemporary proof, noting how strange it would be for such an intellectually curious man to never once write about having an alligator in his house. The story, it seems, is a ghost in the historical archives. So, where did it come from? The trail leads not to the 1820s, but decades later. The earliest known printed mention of an alligator in the Adams White House appears in 1888, in a book titled The Household of John Quincy Adams by Harriet Taylor Upton, a full 63 years after the supposed event. Upton's version is also significantly less dramatic. She writes that the East Room was used by Lafayette to store the many curiosities sent to him, and that some live alligators were among them. In this telling, the alligators belong to Lafayette, not Adams, and they are simply being stored among other items, with no mention of a bathtub or of the president using them to frighten guests. The more sensational version of the story appears to have evolved in later secondary sources. Many modern accounts engage in what historians call circular sourcing, often citing the Presidential Pet Museum, which for years presented the story as fact but could not provide a primary source and has since published an article acknowledging the story is probably not true. In the end, the tale of John Quincy Adams' alligator tells us less about the 6th president and more about ourselves and our relationship with history. The myth endures not because it is true, but because it is a great story. It injects a dose of wild eccentricity into the legacy of a president often perceived as cold, intellectual, and aloof. It links two monumental figures of the era, Adams and Lafayette, in a memorable and bizarre anecdote, enhancing the mythology surrounding both. The alligator in the bathtub serves a narrative purpose, humanizing a formidable statesman by giving him a mischievous, almost prankish side. This final investigation serves as a fitting conclusion to a tour through the President's Menagerie. From Jefferson's very real bears to Van Buren's phantom tigers, these stories reveal that our understanding of the past is a constant negotiation between documented fact and compelling folklore. We are drawn to tales that make our leaders seem larger than life, more interesting, and more human. The alligator in the East Room may be a fiction, but its persistence in our collective memory proves that sometimes the stories we want to be true become a kind of history all their own.